appelés pour parler justement de la croissance des inégalités et des risques que cela comporte dans les sociétés de demain. Les différents intervenants donc, qui vont venir nous rejoindre pour cette table ronde, donc officiellement intitulée Égalité et intégration, quelle société pour demain? Alors j'appelle sur la scène Martine Durand, qui est chef statisticien et directeur de la direction des statistiques de l'OCDE à Paris. Martine Durand, merci de venir nous rejoindre. Également Ricardo Fuentes Nieva, qui est le directeur exécutif d'Oxfam Mexique. Merci d'être là. Ashwin Mahesh, qui est membre fondateur du Bangalore Political Action en Inde. Khalid Malik, l'ancien directeur du rapport sur le développement humain du PNUD à New York. Clara Rojas González, qui est élue à la Chambre des représentants, ancienne directrice exécutive de la Fondation País Libre de Colombie. Et l'autre modérateur, que je salue à nouveau, merci, please welcome. Greg Lindsay. Asseyez-vous.
Thank you so much. Please pardon me if I speak in English. All right. Thank you again. Please pardon me if I speak in English. Thank you for joining us for this session. As you've heard, with the preceding keynote and in the preceding panel before that, of which I was a participant, that we've arrived at really what seems to be the big issue of the afternoon, which is inequality and integration, and how do we solve not just the future of labor, but the rather underlying challenges of an increasingly unequal world. Of course, I'll start with Martine in a moment on this and some of the questions about tracking these trends, where that even as inequality between nations has declined, we've seen rising inequality within nations, and we've seen it rising faster, it seems, if I understand it correctly, within developed nations. That inequality has become a developed world challenge, not the one that was always confined to the global south, as we once imagined. And this, of course, raises all sorts of interesting challenges about, how do we basically, ideally reverse this trend, a challenge which I expect us to solve in the next hour and 15 minutes. We will reconstruct society very shortly. But also, second, what happens in a world where, we see power concentrated in the hands of these elites? Just as we've seen in various nations that stumble into resource wealth, the so-called resource curse that creates petrostates with wealth and power concentrated in the hands of the few, are we going to see the rise of techno-states, finance states, places where essentially state capture is happening with these sort of, particularly wealthy, powerful, and equal institutions? How are we going to actually sort of hack away at inequality? What does it actually mean to be in an equal society? Is it just income? Is it just wealth? Are there other factors at play here? And then finally, how can we actually start reconstructing this? What are the new institutions that we need? How can we begin to reverse these trends, which have now been in progress for, 35, 40 years perhaps, that we've seen? So these are some of the big questions that I hope we're going to get into. I'm going to start with a question for each of our panelists. We'll go down the line to talk about what they're interested in and how this applies to their work, and we'll go from here. And Martine, particularly as the chief statistician of the OECD, you've been tracking this more closely than anyone else. And so I'm curious, the latest findings. A year ago, of course, with Thomas Piketty's book, everyone had inequality on their lips, and what kind of inequality it is. So what are the current state of the trends, and what should we expect?
Okay, well, first of all, thank you for having me on this panel. I'll be happy to. I'm sorry, I'm speaking in English because I think all the panelists are speaking in English. It'd be easier to entertain a conversation. So let me give you a few facts because I think it is important to start with the figures. As you said in your introductory remarks, it's true that inequalities has become an agenda for OECD countries, developed countries, and at the OECD we've been tracking these developments. So let's start with the facts. Income inequalities have increased in 3/4 of OECD countries over the last 3 decades. And now the gap between the rich and the poor is at the highest since 30 years. Today, the rich 10% of the OECD population earn close to 10 times the income of the poorest 10%, while this ratio was 7 to 1 in 1980. So a widening gap in income inequality. And if we look at wealth, because that's a Piketty story, not just income, if we look at wealth, then the concentration of wealth is even more pronounced, where you see that we've started to collect data covering about 20 OECD countries, and we see that the top 1% of the distribution own more wealth than the households in the bottom 60%. So there is really a capture of income and wealth, but by a few in society. This, however, as you also pointed out, doesn't mean that the world has become more unequal, okay? Because it's not because inequality has increased within countries that it has increased across countries. In fact, we've seen a reduction of inequalities across countries, mainly because of China and India, which have grown very fast, which means that they are now more equal to OECD countries, although within China and within India, we do see an increase in inequality as well. But let me just make perhaps a couple of other points, because I think we tend to focus on income and wealth inequalities, which is, of course, the numbers that I just mentioned warrant this focus. But we at the OECD consider that, and that's what Nicolas Hulot just said actually, that inequalities are multifaceted and you should not just look at income and wealth. Let me give you a few examples of where you can see that this inequality spread over other aspects which matter very much either for aspects of people's life or perhaps across population groups. One is if you look at children. We think, often about what's happening. When we talk about income, we think about adults, essentially, because they are the ones who make the income. But if you look at children, 1 in 7 children in OECD countries live in poverty. 1 in 10 live in workless households. And so this is, again, material poverty. But what we see is that these people actually have problems in terms of skills reading, in terms of problem solving as measured by our PISA survey. They are more likely to be bullied at school, and they have weaker relationship with their parents. What I want to say here is that they accumulate these advantages, and it's very important to move beyond the averages to look at what's happening in different groups. If we look at something that struck me when we started to collect this data, you would think that in countries such as the OECD, life expectancy is equal for everyone, more or less. Well, if you look at men at the age of 30, their life expectancy, depending on their educational background, can vary for about 10 years. 10 years, on average, a man at the age of 30 will live 10 years less than someone, if he has a low education background, than someone with a high education background. So just looking at income is not enough. You have to look at health, you have to look at education, you have to look at women. We still haven't solved the gender gap. Women continue to have problems reaching top business positions, persistent double burden of work and family care, and so on. And if I move from what Nicolas Hulot also said, where you live matters a lot for inequalities. If you live in deprived area, you are more likely to also face poor air quality, poor housing, poor water quality, and so on. We've documented this, and we show that we have to be much more comprehensive in the way we approach inequalities by looking at those varied indicators. Now, we're not there yet. I want to make a little bit of publicity. We just launched House Life 2015 in Mexico 2 weeks ago, and that reports on this, but you can see that a lot of gaps in the indicator base to measure these inequalities in the developed countries, let alone developing countries. So the point I wanted to make in this introductory remarks is that inequalities, income and wealth, yes, Piketty, very important, but go beyond. Look at other aspects that matter in people's life, because that's what counts for the people's well-being.
Thank you. I think, and that really underscores some of the policy challenges as well
Yes.
in this, because, I mean, just 2 US examples recently. One, of course, is that life expectancies with death rates of middle-aged, uneducated white men in the United States have begun to rise. And second, there's, of course, a whole debate about how place shapes your life outcomes. But that raises the question of, we can't move every poor person out of their poor neighborhoods into wealthier neighborhoods. It raises the question of how do we invest in these places versus simply moving people out of them. All sorts of challenges involved there. Well, Ricardo, how is life in Mexico? Because again, from a US perspective, we're debating about building a very large wall across our border there without noticing the fact that there are now 1 million less migrants in the United States from Mexico than there were in 2007. So of course, life is better there than the States right now.
Mexico is a very unequal country, and so I work for Oxfam, and before being the chief exec for Oxfam Mexico, I was the director for research for Oxfam. And about a year and a half ago, 2 years ago, we released this report where we found out that the 85 richest people in the world control as much wealth as the bottom half of the world's population. And then a year later, so this January, we updated that figure, and it came down to 80. So 80 people now control, or in January, controlled as much wealth as the bottom half of the population. And then we made a prediction then in January, which was that by 2016, the richest 1% would control half of the world's wealth, and the other 99 would control the other half. And we said, well, that's going to happen by 2016. It's going to happen next year. And then three weeks ago, we were proved wrong, because it's already happening. So it was faster than we thought.
And ruining your timing to next year's dollar.
Yeah. So anyway, and then as part of that inequality work that we've been doing in Oxfam, we decided to do a report in Mexico. And in that report, we tried to calculate what was the share of income going to the top 1% in Mexico, following a methodology similar to Piketty's and size. Because we didn't have that information. Well, it turns out that for all the countries for which we have information, Mexico is the country with the highest share of income going to the top 1%. It's 21%. So 20 cents on every dollar, 21 cents on every dollar go to the richest 1%. And the other thing that we found out is, so Branko Milanovic, the famous inequality economist, did an exercise a couple of years ago, and he asked, who's the richest man in history? Man, it has to be a man for the gender disparities pervasive in history. And he asked, well, I mean, using Adam Smith's measure of wealth, so how many people can a rich man command? The labor of how many people can a rich man command? With the return on their wealth, not with their wealth, with a 5% return on their wealth. And then Milanovic found that the richest man in history was Carlos Slim, a Mexican magnate, a mogul, telecoms mogul. By then, the calculation that Branko did was like around 2005, Milanovic could command the labor force of 440,000 Mexicans with the return on his wealth. Well, we redid the calculation, we look at the trends. So by the latest information, which was about 2012, Carlos Slim can command the labor of how many Mexicans, you think? Just a wild guess.
At 7 figures? I shudder to think it goes into the 8. But
it's 2 million Mexicans.
All right.
With 5% on 5% return. This means like he doesn't need to reduce his wealth. I mean, and those are the levels of disparity in Mexico. And what we've seen in Mexico for the past 20 years is like a very constant poverty rate. It stays like around 48% or something, and the growing fortune of a very few people. And I think part of the problem is that what we see is a lot of rent seeking in Mexico. So yeah, there was, this is part of a globalization and like free trade and privatization, all the changes in the Mexican economy in the early 90s that created these new very rich people. But over the years, what we see is a lot of rent extraction. What we see is that the people whose fortunes are increasing in Mexico are closely related to mining, closely related to telecoms, and closely related to television. And then the question is like, I think part of the question that we want to ask is, what's the fair value of that wealth creation? What's coming from competition and innovation and all the things that we think are good, and what's coming from rent extraction? And actually, the OECD did a study that kind of suggests some facts on that. So Mexico is like the cost of cellular calls in Mexico is much higher than the average in the OECD. And basically, well, I mean, if you do some analysis, the OECD said it very clearly. Well, this is because there is like monopolistic system in cellular phones in Mexico, and then you can actually say, well, I mean, maybe that's the size of the rent. That's the size of the revenue that Slim's company is generating because of his monopolistic situation. Well, what that means, and that's something that I just want to stress, is what that basically means is that like every single day, every Mexican with a cell phone is transferring money to the richest man in the world. He's having a bad year. He's the 4th richest man in the world right now. But every year, poor middle-class Mexicans are transferring money to the richest, to the 4th richest man in the world. Yeah. So that's the state, and I think interestingly or sadly, is not something that's happening only in Mexico. It's happening in rich countries. It's happening in other emerging economies, and I think it's happening in developing countries too.
No, absolutely. I mean, one parallel I immediately think of when you talk about, you first mentioned like mining and extractive industries with rent sinking, and then mentioned telecom. I mean, Peter Thiel, the Silicon Valley billionaire, has openly said that the goal of any startup is to acquire monopolistic positions. So therefore, you then can extract rents in any form you choose. And of course, Google is the largest congressional lobbyer in the United States. So they're out there to defend their data monopoly as well, shaping the debate and protecting their sort of monopoly position that way. So I think we're seeing that across a number of industries. To me, that's one of the meta questions about this, and particularly Piketty's argument too, that this is structural. This is a feature of capitalism as it exists, not a bug. But I want to move down to Ashwin Mahesh, because so far we've talked about inequality. I particularly want to talk about integration with you, Ash, because I know this is one of your particular thoughts on this with your new think tank and the notion of, rather than thinking about it is the job of the state or interest from above to ensure integration, that really something this should be devolved in the truest sense to the people themselves. And I'm hoping you can talk a bit about that.
I actually think we're struggling to have 2 other conversations, and the consequence of that is that we don't know how to talk about inequality. So let's go to those 2 other conversations first, and I'm going to give you a couple of stories. When I was a kid, when my dad brought any chocolate, and my brother and I would fight about the chocolate. I'm sure your siblings and you have fought about the chocolate. And he would do what fathers have always done and what mothers have always done. He would give the chocolate to one of us and say, you divide, and the other one will pick which piece is his, right? Sometimes, when I broke the chocolate, it wouldn't come out exactly half and half, because it's difficult to break a chocolate exactly half and half. And, well, but I didn't mind that, because the process was fair. It was not equal, but the process was fair. Right? So people don't mind inequality as much as they mind unfairness. You have to sort of think about that first. The second thing is, I want to tell you a second story. There's a lady whose office is 4 or 5 doors from my office, and she runs a school for mentally handicapped children. And there are people in the neighborhood who objected to that. And so we don't want to see children like this in our neighborhood. Right? And this is, you might think it's very bad, it's terrible behavior, but a lot of people are thinking that. There's, I don't want to see children like this in my neighborhood. I don't want to see poor people sleeping on the footpath in my neighborhood, and so on and so forth. So when we spoke to the neighbors about all of this thing, some people were for it, some people were against it, and all of that. And one day, this gentleman who complained about the school, he was standing at the gate in front of the school and shouting at the principal and saying, I really don't want to see these kinds of kids here, close your school. And his wife came out of the house. And she said, ignore this man. Ignore this man. If I have to starve him, I will do it, but you go on with what you are doing. And there's a lesson in that. Ordinary people do care about doing the decent thing. But we are trying to organize society in a way that has no place for decency. I'm not saying that we're indecent. We're looking at equality as an economic argument, as an efficiency argument. But this is not the reason why people care about equality. They think that equality is decent. The overwhelming majority of people don't support equality because of good efficiency or good market economics or good structural organizations. They support decency because they think it is the right thing. And a very large number of people also support equality because they think it is the God-fearing thing. But we don't know how to have this conversation in public. We have reached the stage where we say, oh, morality. That's a slippery slope. You start talking about morality, and pretty soon you don't know what you're saying, and 20 people are throwing stones at you, and you sort of leave that alone. Don't go there. What this has meant is that you have taken away the two most important aspects that lead to equality. You have taken away people's motivation for decency, and you have taken away people's capacity for direct action on the ground to make things better. And you are trying to construct a state and a society and a market that have removed the most important inputs and are seeking outcomes that are supposed to come from those inputs. This is the fundamental problem. I call this the 3 Ds. The inequality can be tackled by direct action, not indirect action. We do all sorts of things. We think education will help. We think healthcare will help. We think retraining will help. All these things will help, of course. But you need direct action that empowers people in their own neighborhoods and their own spheres of activity to promote equality. Then we need decentralized action. It's a very funny thing. We all live in democracies, and if you ask people how much of your money would you like to give to the federal government, and how much would you like to give to the state government, and how much would you like to give to your local government, in country after country after country, people will tell you that they would like to give more money to local government, less to state government, and very little to the national government. But in the name of democracy, in country after country, we have the exact opposite, right? And we have to think about it. And there's a reason for that. We are behaving today as though government has created the citizens. We need to start behaving as though citizens have created the government. And what I mean by that is this. We think that good motivation, good behavior at the local level, we think of it as civic action. Right? I do something for my neighbor, that is Samaritanship. I do something for my neighborhood, that is civic action. We need to start thinking of action at the local level as a kind of government too. Most people listen to Abraham Lincoln and he'll say, oh, government of the people, for the people, by the people. Most people listen to that and they assume that all 3 mean the same thing. But if all 3 mean the same thing, you don't have to say them separately. Of the people and for the people are very different from by the people. We have to start asking what we mean by government by the people. And if people were truly more self-governing, they would in fact make choices that are less unequal. And we have to believe that. Now, and the problem is that in most countries they will say, oh, these local fellows, you don't know them. They're capable of hideous things in the name of self-determination and local control. In fact, they will make things much worse if you give them the power to do things. This is the standard argument against localization. But my sense is that we've never given that model a fair chance. We need to give that model a fair chance within a framework of rights protection by national governments and a better law enforcement and better justice systems, but essentially empowering people in their own neighborhoods to not only care about equality, but also act in response to what they see as caring about equality. If you do that, you will begin to separate responsible people from irresponsible people. And we have to say one thing. No society can afford to treat responsible people as equal to irresponsible people. Because when you start to do that, again, you're sort of incentivizing irresponsibility. But we don't know how to have that conversation too, because we think responsibility is a moral sphere, and we avoid that.
All right, we'll come back to more of this. Khalid, your experience, I mean, the UNDP is pretty much the opposite end of the scale from the local action that Ash is prescribing here. So I'm curious about how much his recommendations correspond, align with your work at UNDP and the Human Development Report, and really what we know about best practices about development in developing countries when it comes to inequality.
Well, let me start by saying good afternoon, everyone, and it's great to be here. Actually, when Ashwin talked about Abraham Lincoln, by the people, for the people, and all of that, that is in some ways the definition of human development, about people themselves. And maybe I'll say a few words about inequality and then talk about principles, because we are getting into principles. I think Martin started the conversation well by trying to say that fundamentally inequality is a much broader phenomenon than income alone. And I think that's very important. And I'll give perhaps two examples of that. Take the case of children less than 3 years. This is a study which we did in the 2014 Global Human Development Report. I should say my successor, Salim Jahan, is also here, so I'm very pleased by that, and he's talking tomorrow. And they found something quite impressive. This is also work done by Heckman and others, that the division between children of high-income families and low-income families starts opening up much before they go to school. And we term this phenomenon as 2 million more words. A child listens to 2 million more words if they belongs to a professional family as opposed to a blue-collar family. And this is true in the States, it's true in developing countries. And these things persist over time. So that's why I introduced the idea of life cycle, life capabilities. Amartya Sen and I were together some years ago, and he mentioned something quite interesting. In India, they did longitudinal studies, 60 years and more, and basically found that heart disease in men can be predicted by how children are treated before the age of 3, both nurture and nutrition. You actually do that. But society does not invest much in early childhood. And that's the sad part, and I'll come back to that. The second example I give will be a very macro example. Tony Atkinson is a very distinguished UK economist, and he looked at 2 periods in UK economic history, the 80s and 90s. One period was meant to be much better than the other period. But the minute you adjust for inequality, it almost reversed. So you have to ask the basic question, whose growth are you measuring? When a finance minister in a country produces good results, 3%, 4% growth rates, everyone applauds that. But they do not ask the next question, what is more important? So this led to me to talk about principles. Ashwin also was exploring principles. The principle is that all human beings have a right to equal life chances. It's something that Immanuel Kant and Amartya Sen and Mahbub Haq, the founder of the Human Development Board, have promoted under the term what we call human development. But equal treatment does not guarantee that. So in order to promote equal life chances, you have to give unequal attention to the poor and the disadvantaged. That's the only way to get to that. And this is what means putting people first. And that has to go through concepts, policies, and measures. It is amazing to me still that it's very easy to defend subsidies for the rich. But everyone has an opinion, generally negative, when you subsidize the poor. So there must be some moral dimension which is missing there. When we're doing the 2014 Human Development Report, we found some interesting things. We tried to examine why some societies and some groups feel marginalized or unable to come together in society or are prone to violence. And one big issue was actually equal treatment, equal access to social services. When people do not have that, over time these things build up into a sense of not being treated properly. And gradually, some take up arms, and a lot of the violence is actually connected to that. The second point I will highlight is that, this whole debate of discrimination and social cohesion, social capital, although social capital is not a great word in my view, but fundamentally how people relate to each other is very much dependent on how they're looked at by society, what laws there are, what anti-discrimination provisions there are, how are they treated. If you are a Muslim in India or you're a Hindu in Pakistan, you will feel very quickly that even high income, good education, good health will not prevent you from feeling vulnerable, because your full citizenship rights are not guaranteed. So integration is formally a function of public goods. Whatever direct action you do at the personal level, that's very good. We have family foundations which do that, and I can see there's a tremendous reward both for the person giving the support and the person receiving it. But at the macro level, you have to treat it as a public good issue. You take the case of South Asia, the debate on education is very revealing in South Asia. The notion of public education in South Asia has also disappeared, because people in India, in Pakistan, Bangladesh, all feel public education is not performing, and therefore they must go to private education. Whereas history tells us the minute you do that, you're creating inequality and profoundly for a long period of time in society. In the US, for instance, there's not only inequality in terms of income, there's a profound inequality building up in terms of education because of the rise of public education. Even though up to high school, most of education is still public, which I think is a great thing what the US has done. So I think unless we take a broader perspective, and that's why I appreciate Martin's presentation, that inequality has to be addressed in this way. It's not something to say that X number of people own so much of income. I think that's the wrong way of dealing with it. You have to say most of society must benefit and come together. And therefore, the minute you start differentiating between people, you run the risk. There was a study done that if you do not bring the middle class into social protection schemes, those schemes cannot be sustained because taxation depends on the middle class. Yep. So you have to bring mechanisms which build provisions for whole society. And that's a distinction, I would say, between social safety nets and social protection. Yep. In the end, the basic line, which I'll close, is that if you look after people, the people will look after the economy and society. Thank you.
Thanks. Well, I think we've established that that inequality is terrible across every number of vectors, from income and wealth to life expectancy and everything else. I'm hoping to use Clara to use you as a beginning and transition of what we can do about it, because I know in urbanism circles, which I traffic, Colombia and particularly Medellin and Bogota are two of the great, really interesting examples of physical interventions in the environment to increase integration. In Medellin, of course, the funiculars on the hillside and the cable car systems to integrate the informal settlements. And many people I know cheered the re-election of Enrique Peñalosa as mayor of Bogota for his investments in cycle lanes and other forms of public transport to increase physical integration there. So I'm curious, if you have in particular experience on thoughts on how Colombia is actually intervening in the built environment to increase integration and other sort of your other work in this sort of area, because it strikes me that Colombia is a real sort of leader in this space.
Okay, thanks. Let me know first thank you for and from the forum to be here. This is the first thing. And thanks for permitting to have the opportunity to share with you some reflections. The first thing to point of view is important that in Colombia we have around 50 million people, right? But 11 live in totally poverty, right? And can you imagine how is it difficult from the people to access to education and to service of health and to obtain the first job? I think the most important thing is to guarantee and to facilitate the people to go to the school and the university and to find a job and to have the opportunity to receive the public service. But the other thing that is very important, as you know, as we have involved in the process, peace process, right? And we have a point with human rights too. And the other point that we have problem is in climate change too. In Colombia, annually we have around 600 disasters. And can you imagine what different problems that we have? Not only the inequality and injustice problem, but we have the other problems, the violence, and of course the climate change. This is the reason because it's difficult, but we are working to control those types of challenges, right? For human rights, for example, as you know, I was kidnapping for 6 years. Other people were kidnapping for 14 years. Can you imagine the break in the laboral life? It's very difficult for the person to obtain their pension and the final of the end of their lives, no? Because they don't have the opportunity to have a safe life. No? This is now we live we are involved in the peace process. This is the first problem that we have to resolve. We expect in the next year, but we have all the challenges built together, right? but we expect in the many few years we can to open the access, the people to go to the schools, to high school, to university is very important. I think is the main point than the government and all the policies will be taking account, right? And the other thing, of course, is to invite a lot of enterprise to go to invest in view or in order to guarantee to find a job for many people, right?
Great. Well, thank you so much. I think we now have about 30 minutes now that we've outlined how we need to break up the oligarchs, end marginalization, help people escape concentrated poverty, reinforce public safety. All right, 30 minutes. How do we do this, team? Martine, you seem ready. You seem ready with suggestions here.
No, I'm not. Of course, I'm not going to solve the problem. I mean, my shoulders are too not big enough. But I wanted to react to what you seem to present as an opposition between going local or focusing on the people and the national level.
Would love to hear your thoughts on this.
Right, which I think is a very interesting way, because I don't think we should oppose the two. I think we should really look at complementary actions and policy. There is a role for everybody to some extent. At the people level, interestingly, we have a chapter in this 2005 edition of House Life focusing on volunteering, the role that volunteering does to actually address this cohesion, integration, and improving the well-being of people. Of course, we demonstrate that if, first of all, lots of people spend a lot of time volunteering. So in a sense, there is this contribution of people themselves to the well-being of others. But by doing that, they also get a lot out of it, which is that also increase their own well-being to some extent. And we've even tried to put a price on it. I know you don't want to monetize everything, but if you do so, you show that on average, it would add 2% of GDP, and on average, the returns in terms of earnings because of the skills you learn and so on and so forth can be as large as 14% of added earnings if you wanted to monetize it. But of course, we know this is not just monetization. So volunteering, spending time is good for your own well-being and is good for the well-being of others. So yes, there is a role for people to do. At the local level, for local governments, we know that most of the services, education, health, access to broadband, internet, and so on and so forth, is delivered at local level. So local governments have a big role to play. But I would say we should not avoid the responsibility of national government. They are elected for that. And at the national level, we have documented that the tax and benefit systems have been much less redistributive over the past years than they had been in the past. So in other words, the capacity of governments to tax and then redistribute has been lowered. And so there again, there is a role to understand why is it so, how much do we want to redistribute? I don't think we should be normative. I mean, at least for the OECD, we're not normative. We're just pointing to what has happened, and then it's for each, of course, elected government to decide. But it is a fact that the tax and benefit systems have become less redistributive. At the international level, we've been working a lot on this famous BEPS, base erosion and profit shifting. The fact that big companies don't pay, the Googles and so on, I mean, don't pay taxes anywhere, yes, certainly is something for governments to do. I mean, it won't be done at the local level of people. I mean, they have a responsibility there to do something, and that's what the OECD has been contributing to. But my last point is about the fact that when we look, and I want to come back to the point I made that inequalities are multifaceted, and then you have to look at the broader picture, because in terms of policy making, this is essential. Let me just give you an example. We went to China with this agenda saying, look, you know, the way you've grown, the quality of your growth, the fact that you've moved people from rural areas have moved to the coastal areas of China, that the children have been left behind in terms of societal future, I mean, future for your society, that has major consequences. The fact that the rural urban divide is growing, and so on and so forth, should be taken into consideration. But importantly, the fact that this growth has also gone with a lot of environmental problems and so on. If you want to solve some of these problems, it's not by looking at one area only that you will solve the problem. In Beijing, you can breathe the air. So people are sick. They have lung problems. They have health problems. It's not by building another hospital in Beijing that you're going to solve this problem. It's by addressing environment, which means that both the environment and health ministries and treasury have to work together in the allocation of resources and defining priorities. In other words, you need to have much more joined up policy approaches rather than the silo way we have of making policies in all our countries, where health ministers talk about spending on health, where education ministers speak about education. The data I gave you about the link between education and health is telling. So we have to stop working in silos. We have to have government departments work together under perhaps the Prime Minister's office, where you have these joined up policies. That's true at national, that's true at local, involving the local and involving the people. So it's another way of making policies that needs to be, as much as having the good diagnosis is important, the way to go about it, the implementation, if you don't change the way you do things, you're not going to get there.
Great point. Any responses to that before I ask another question? Anyone?
The thing about it, though, is that if you really want to change things, you have to not just tinker with them. You have to change them dramatically. To simply say the data is telling us this, and therefore we must do this slightly different from how we've done it in the past, is not going to be enough. You have to do it dramatically differently. And when people say that you have to do things dramatically differently, the objection can't be, oh, but that's too dramatic. If that's what it takes, that's what you'll have to do. And I think that's what we're struggling with. Who is going to take the conversation about equality into public forums? The politicians. And what are you finding today? That the overwhelming majority of politicians who take the conversation about equality into public forums are speaking a language of populism, which isn't fundamentally helping anybody. Therefore, you either construct a public language that isn't centered around populism, but is genuinely supportive of the quest for equality, or you're going to get the alternative, which is that if you avoid one type of conversation which is closely linked to the solution, you can have any number of other conversations which will not get you to the solution.
Well, I want to go to Ricardo real fast and then Clara. It's interesting that you jumped up on the populism side, because the question I wanted to ask Ricardo about this is, when Martine says there's a role for the state here, what happens when you have effective state capture? I mean, in the United States, for example, just as there are a handful of families that control the majority of global wealth, we're seeing that a handful of families are essentially funding our elections, and essentially are able to dictate policy. So how do we get out of that trap as well, not just the populism? And then I want to hear Claire's thoughts too.
Well, I mean, I think that's the crux of the problem, and I think that's why we have to understand how the process of this extreme wealth is transforming to these unequal chances. Because otherwise, if we say, I agree, inequalities I care about multifaceted inequalities, but if I say I just care about them, it's just motherhood and apple pie. And if I don't understand the process of how that extreme concentration of income and wealth leads to concentration of power through campaign finance, through lobby, through capture of the judiciary or whatever, and then how that trickles down into all kinds of decisions that relate to public expenditure, relate to the fiscal system, relate to the way the media relates to the elites and the rest of society, we won't be able to solve it. So I think what we need to understand, and I think that relates to Ash's point, is that this is a political issue. This is an issue about power. So it's not an issue about economic resources. Is that relationship between this concentration of economic resources and how the holders of those resources exercise their power formally and informally, either through the political system or through all kinds of other areas. So I think what concerns me the most is that we're talking about political capture. We're talking about economic capture, and the discussion on jobs is a reflection of how the systems are benefiting only a few. But we're also talking about something that I think it's kind of a cultural capture, that idea that the poor are poor because they deserve it, and the deserving rich, when what we actually see is that a lot of that wealth is coming from rent seeking, so it's not fair. You know, so it's true. Like, I mean, fairness has a place in this analysis, but I think we need to understand how that process turns out, and that process is through this exercise of power in the different elements in the different elements of society. And I think if we don't pay attention to that, if we just lump all the inequalities into one basket, we'll be just missing the point, and we won't be able to pull the thread and say, you know, like, this is where we need to act, at the local level, at the state level, at the national level.
Well, and this is why I want to go to Claire and then Khalid on this, but it strikes me that this is, you know, I think what I found interesting about Ash's point about we need a new conversation, a new language about this, because it's interesting to me, you know, when he's calling upon, we need to think about this as a moral issue and decency issue. Again, in the United States, what is the argument for reducing inequality? I mean, the most anodyne argument you can make is, well, economic growth is hampered by inequality. I mean, it's the most anodyne way you can actually argue it. So it's a question of, you know, can we reconstruct it in different terms? Claire, first you and then Khalid, please.
Okay, thanks. No, few things. Regarding the Martin presentation, she talking about is the very, very important main point about the level, the local level, and the second is the work, voluntary work. But in addition to things more, we need very strong institutions, because it's very important the public offer, the service of the public offer. And the other thing is you have to need to involve the middle class in the making process, because this is the manner that you permit that the middle class participate in the resolve their problems, right?
Khalid, please.
Let me attempt to give an example. Let me compare China with Pakistan. I'm a Pakistani. I lived in China. And what fascinated me was that how the Communist Party ideology is all about producing developmental benefits. And it knows if it cannot produce development benefits, it will be moved out. It has a long history of when the emperor does not succeed in meeting the aspirations of the peasants or the citizens, they are pushed out. And then I compare that with my own country, which is a democracy. We have groups who have been in power, families who have been in power for a long time. I think it's not a question of not saying power is connected. Of course it is, we know that. But how do we actually affect that? How do we change that? And the reason why things change in China and not in Pakistan. In Pakistan, we have a group of people who notionally are pro-developer. In reality, they're not, because you see it by their actions. Whereas in China, you know that these guys are hustling every day to keep things moving forward. So if I were trying to understand why didn't this happen in Pakistan, it's very simple. We never had the societal adjustments which preceded what happened in China. The land reforms we tried to do were very nominal land reforms. So the landlords became politicians, became our leaders. And Pakistan is one of the few countries in the world which has no agriculture income taxation, even though most of the land is owned by very rich landlords. These people look after themselves. That's a fundamental issue. So that's the broad, big picture issue. But there's also a more specific issue, and that may also be relevant to other countries like India, which is Deng Xiaoping, they used to say, is a short man who can see very far. So his vision basically kept China together for 50 plus years. And he made a very interesting kind of, Chinese planning is by visionary statements. So his statement was, you cross the stream by feeling the stones. So never introduce a macro policy all in one go. And China has never done that, by the way. It has always experimented, piloting, changing something, and then rolling it out. Because the Chinese have been worried that with 1.3 billion people, if you do something, the risks become too large. And another dimension which is moving very rapidly is education. We have over 600 million people on the web in China. So the scrutiny by the citizens on public officials is enormous. And being a Chinese official is probably the worst job you can get these days, because you're under harassment all the time, not only to perform by the party and your superiors, but also by the citizens whether you've done something. A few years ago, there was a big train accident near Tianjin. The first instinct of the official was to bury the train. Now imagine trying to bury a whole train so that you kind of get rid of all the evidence. But people were filming it, they put it out on the web. The Prime Minister had to go and issue a kind of a call for a full investigation. They put people out in prison. It does matter, power does matter. But we have to be also very clear what the solutions are. And the solutions, the core of the solutions are public goods issues, whether it's at the national level or the public, at the sub-national, we can debate these things. But if you don't do that, you will then put the seeds in the future problems down the road.
Yes. Ashwin.
Two things happen which could be done, which could be reversed at the national level, which would help the overall framework. One is that we keep talking about subsidies for the poor and subsidies for the rich, right? I think many countries could adopt an equal subsidy law. If somebody who owns a house is entitled to a mortgage interest deduction subsidy from the federal government that can run to thousands of dollars each year, why isn't thousands of dollars available to poor families who don't even have the house in the first place towards buying a house, right, if nothing else? If you're going to give me $11,000 in subsidy to buy my house, give every poor family 11,000 rupees, $11,000 in an account that they can use towards buying a house. So you can have an equal subsidy law that is useful, or they may use the money for something else, number one. Second, even sort of capitalistic regimes and businesses use rules that are actually tailored towards fairness. The American Football League, for example, allows the team that came last in last year's tournament to pick first. Not FIFA. Well, FIFA is kind of different. So if you come last in last year's tournament, you get the first pick in this year's draft. So it's not impossible to design structurally for doing away with these kinds of things. However, having said that, I think the biggest reform that we need to have is tax reform. As long as you continue to give the majority of your taxes to a national government, it will remain easier and easier for power to be captured by capturing those who are very far from you. It is difficult to capture the guy who lives next to you. And that is the way to tackle inequality, to essentially bring the tax power down to the local government and the state government and away from the national government.
Ricardo, please.
Yeah, I think we're moving towards I think one of the most relevant issues, which is the issue of democratic accountability. Not democracy, because very often we think of democracy as voting every 6 years and then forgetting what the president or the mayor or the Congress people are doing, but that of democratic accountability and how citizens relate and demand people in power to deliver these goods. And I think, I mean, there's a lot of efforts into that. How do you think of connecting the different people in power to citizens through social budget monitoring or through
participatory budgeting?
Exactly, like all these things. The question is like, it's like I think that's one of the channels to kind of like reverse this trend. But the question is, how long will it take? And will we see the results? How can we focus on those efforts if we don't see the results in 3 months or 6 months, in 2 years probably? And the other issue is, I think these inequality trends in history have been reversed through shocks. Either the Great Depression or a massive war and things like that. And I think we haven't been thinking hard enough on how to reverse those trends without a shock. Or
I would say one of the lessons of Piketty is it took massive exogenous change in the form of multiple world wars to destroy those dynastic fortunes. There was actually no arguable policy intervention to reduce inequality, if Piketty's analysis is correct.
But then there are other shocks that have not reversed the trends.
No.
You know, look, I mean, the crisis in 2007, 2008 was arguably a massive shock. And yeah, there were talks about regulation of the financial system and all that, but at the end it didn't reverse the trends. On the opposite, it kind of like quantitative easing accelerated it.
Martine, please, you want to jump in?
Yeah, I just wanted to react to what you said, Ricardo, and saying, well, you know, we have all this information on our table and so on, and you put all this in front of us, but doesn't help us. In fact, it puts everything in the same basket, and then we don't know what to do about it. Well, I think this is a caricature. First of all, I think we need to do three things. The what, and we have to understand what's happening, and so having the information is the first step. That is absolutely necessary, because not documenting what's happening is the opening the door to all kind of I don't know what, but populism certainly, because you know not providing the evidence is certainly contributing to populism. So I continue to believe, of course, in my position, you would understand that I will defend that. So I want to inform and provide the data and provide the information. But it's not, I don't want to stop there, of course. I mean, I'm not providing data to put the data on the table, mix this up and say, now do what you want. I mean, so the next question is why? Why is this happening? And that's very important. So you need to understand what explains those trends and decompose, I mean, you know, deconstruct, as some French philosophers would say, to understand why we see what we're seeing. And that goes to, you know, we talked about childcare education, we talked about tax systems, we talked about jobs in the previous sessions, and so on and so forth. And you have to understand why is this, and try possibly to also understand what are the main drivers, and so you can see where the priorities should be. And those may be different in different countries, so you may see different situations in different countries. And so explain why, so that's the second point. But then you have to move one step beyond that and to say, how? Now that you have understood why this is happening, how are you going to deal with it? And that's the third stage. And here again, I think we shouldn't, I mean, we should really propose solutions. And I think, you know, of course, that's the bread and butter of the work that we're doing here at the OECD, is to look at what countries are trying to do and compare the experiences in different countries and try to share best practices. And I would like to, in this, to talk about this democratic accountability, which I think is very interesting and very fundamental. But if you see some experiences in some countries, what do they do with this data that they collect because we tell them to do so, or because they feel that it is absolutely essential? After they've done the why and they've tried to understand what's happening, then they use this in different ways. Some countries are using them in their budgetary processes, which is depending on where they've, you know, why these things are happening, and they've identified where, then they will use this information to actually decide on their priority allocations. And they are accountable to their parliament for the decision they make on the budget. So parliament, we haven't talked about that, but that's in democratic countries, you know, the fact that you have people that you have elected and are in parliament. Perhaps they can capture power and so on, but nevertheless they have a role to play. So I think putting this information out that enters the budgetary process and the allocation of resources at the end of the day into the different policy areas, priority areas, I think this is very important. But I think the democratic accountability goes a step further. And that requires, of course, all our governments, at least in OECD countries, have been democratically elected, so you can say that, okay, they represent the voice of the people. But the democratic accountability is also to going back to the people and ask them what matters most for them, also regularly. And you have to have this engagement with civil society to check that this is indeed what matters to them. And this is part of the democratic accountability. So I think there is a very big agenda in this area, in terms of, you know, the what, the why, and the how, that is on the table. So we certainly shouldn't stop at just providing the information. That's not what we do, by the way.
Well, I really enjoyed this last particular exchange, because we started with Khalid's story there about China and Pakistan, which led us into the whole area of accountability. I was thinking social compact was the phrase in my head when you were telling the stories. There was a Chinese social compact about that, which many essentially oligarchies do not have that with their people in terms of delivering services and delivering that. And we got into this really excellent accountability. But to me, particularly, Martine, your comments on this and the notion of, well, some nations, they take this data and take it back into their process. Well, that's because they have good institutions, which of course to me is like the great moral of the story and also the kind of downer of the story, because it takes decades, if not centuries, to build really great institutions. And before I want to go to Claire with the question, I just thought it was interesting where you talk about going back to the public and listening to what they want. I think that's actually where you and Ashwin agree, because that's really what he's arguing is a sort of revolutionary version of local governance. You can make that point again in a second, but I want to ask Claire first. As someone who's been involved in government, I'm curious your experiences in Colombia's building of those institutions and how this actually gets done, because it's not something that can be done in a handful of years. It's a very tectonic process.
First, let me know, talking about, or regarding the Ricardo's, about accountability. I think accountability is very important, but it's very important to have, to guarantee a system, democratic system, right? Because, for example, in several countries in Latin America, we don't have a democratic system. For example, in Cuba or maybe in Venezuela. It's very important that the people have the opportunity to vote, to be involved in the making decision power, right? This is the first thing. And the other thing regarding your question, I say that in Colombia we live a very important process, I think so. We are in the middle on the transform generation, I think so. In general terms, we have a nice democracy because we have the different institutions. Of course, we are in process. We have many problems. And is that I have to say. Maybe in the other time I can, okay?
Great. Ash, then Khalid, you had a point too,
Well,
please.
you can have a lot of democratic accountability without any democracy. I mean, Bhutan has democratic accountability. They don't have democracy. So in a way, I'm not a big fan of democratic accountability in a standalone basis. I agree, I concede even a lot of the things that Martin said about the what and the how and the why. But democracy is not about what and how and why. Democracy is about who, right? Who does what is the most important thing. Now, in the last, 250 years, we've sort of reached the point where we now think of government as something that is done by other people for you. And I think that is the basic problem. That if you think of government as something that is done by other people, you can't possibly have democratic institutions that are strong. You have to reimagine government in a way that at least some part of it is done by you. That's why the by the people part matters. It's not for family foundations. It's for ordinary citizens to be part of democracy. That if we imagine democracy in a way that we think that everything that is done by me is not part of government, and only the things that are done by other people is part of government, then I can never feel part of that government to begin with.
I could watch Martine shake her head at you all day, Ash. But first, I want Khalid, and then we'll come back to the democratic rebuttal.
Ashwin also encouraged me to comment a little bit. Huh? I think we have to be also a bit careful not to think of, we have to look at history for what it tells us, and not to have an idea which doesn't really play in historic terms. We have to keep our feet on the ground fundamentally. Huh? I think, of course, you want all the good things. You want democracy by the people, for the people. You want education. You want a high level of income. All of these things are great. The question is, how do we get to that particular point? What do we do about it? And let me just touch the more mundane issue in a way. Measurement matters. What you measure matters a lot. If you measure growth rates and do not ask the question whose growth it is, you already lost the battle. It doesn't matter whether citizens feel engaged partly or wholly or not. When we do, as Salim Jahan has to now deal with these headaches because he's going to launch the 2015 report soon. When we launch the report, we actually grade countries by how well they've done in human development terms, HDI index. And you cannot imagine the pressure which comes up, because if countries do well, they love us. But countries who do not do well hate us. And in a UN context, they put a lot of pressure on us to kind of change data and things like that. Measurement matters. So what you measure, if you measure how people's lives are progressing, that's the real litmus test. So, and then you go to the next step. You look at, can you do pro-people budgets? You'll be amazed when you look at, we did some years ago a study on how budgets look. Most budgets in the world are not pro-poor. It doesn't matter what people say. It doesn't matter what politicians say. So if you try to develop these things, you can do that. And I think this notion of in a vacuum talking about citizen engagement doesn't make much sense. You have to be very precise and clear how that engagement will transform. Development is fundamentally about transformation. And the triggers for transformation is education, actually. You get educated, you get empowered. You feel you have a greater view on things. The relationship between the citizen and the state changes. You expect more from the state even. This is the lessons we drew from looking at the Arab Spring carefully. The Arab Spring happened mostly in countries where the gap between people coming into the labor market and those getting jobs were the highest. Yeah. So, there are actually things you can measure. We can tell you a lot, as opposed to a certain amount of looking at theoretical perspectives.
Yes, Clara, please, and we'll come back.
Yeah, regarding your exposure, I'd like to say that not only the budget is important to go the other step more. You have to go searching about the implementation. In Spanish, they say execution of resources, and to have the opportunity to measure the impact of the programs. No, I think so. Thanks.
Great. All right, Ricardo, do you have any last comments? Martine's going to give the last word of this round, and then we're going to go to audience questions. So, Ricardo, do you have any other thoughts you want to toss in?
I think we're not in great disagreement about democratic accountability and democracy. I think it's not either or. You need both, and you need both on a daily basis and at different levels, and you need that at the international level because, that's happening. I mean, that power is unequal and unfair power structures also occur at the international level. But I think, in my experience, so I used to work for the Inter-American Development Bank in the late 90s. And back then, talking about inequality was just like, it was not allowed. It was the politics of envy. And I think what changed over the past 15 years is the renaissance of political economy. And I think it's true that political economy has to take a lot of context into account. But I think the biggest contribution of this political economy analysis is to actually think of in terms of power relations, and how to alter those power relations. It is that transformation that we need. How do we change those power relations? And in a way, this topic of inequality is an issue of empowerment. How do we empower society, groups in society, to actually hold the power to account? And that's, I don't think there's major disagreement in terms of democratic accountability to democracy. And I don't want to go into the details of what that means in terms of democracy and democratic accountability, but it's about power relations at different levels.
I have this overwhelming urge to go home and read the prison diaries right now. Martine, please.
No, I think it's time for perhaps for questions. I think we don't fundamentally disagree. We just perhaps give some complementary answers and responses. But perhaps we come from different perspectives. And the point there is that I don't think we should dismiss our democratic institutions too much either. It's very good to, as I said, to go back to the people, engage with civil society, understand what matters to people, have them say. But I'm in this country, in France, and we see what's happening when democratic institutions don't work, okay? So with this rise in populism and saying, they're all the same and they don't address our concerns, so we're going to go for the far right and so on next time. So I think, we have institutions matter. This is something that most probably in the past we were looking at the economy, and we were looking at some aspects of the economy and so on, and we were thinking, no matter what the institutions, the things will happen. Yeah. No, institutions do matter and matter a lot. And in fact, this is recognized, by the way, in the new Sustainable Development Goals that have been endorsed by the General Assembly at the UN, where there is a whole range of goals dealing with implementation and with strengthening institutions and so on. And I think, then it's perhaps up to each country and to each societies to decide on what institution they want to have. But certainly, without strong institutions, we are in trouble. So, democratic institutions, of course, not any kind of institution.
On that cheery note, I don't want to risk going over time. So, I would like to open up to the audience for any questions you might have. I believe there are a few folks with microphones who are roaming around. Do we have any questions for our panelists? Give you a moment.
Right. In the back over there.
Do we have one? Sorry. Yes, in the back, please. Sorry, I was in line of sight of the camera. Please identify yourself, too.
Yes, okay. My English is not very, very good. I will speak in French. I progress first. Well, je ne suis pas très, très optimiste lorsqu'on parle des inégalités. Tout simplement parce que, en fait, les inégalités sont dues à beaucoup de raisons. Et on voit très bien qu'on ne peut pas facilement s'attaquer à ces inégalités. Vous avez souligné le rôle que peut jouer l'État, et puis parler du système de taxation qu'on peut revoir, et parler également de la nécessité de la démocratie. Alors, je vais prendre quelques exemples pour illustrer un peu mon pessimisme. Si vous regardez à l'intérieur des États, très souvent, il y a une compétition entre les pouvoirs, c'est-à-dire le pouvoir politique et le pouvoir économique. Et on voit très bien que souvent, le pouvoir économique tend à dominer sous le pouvoir politique, ce qui fait que, généralement, il y a du chantage, parfois des entreprises qui disent, voilà, si vous le taxez, et puis on déménage, voilà, tout simplement. Ça, c'est un. De deux, lorsqu'on parle du système de taxation, on peut voir, par exemple, à l'intérieur de l'Union européenne, que lorsqu'on n'a pas harmonisé le système de taxation, ou bien le système fiscal à l'intérieur des pays, c'est très difficile. Vous avez une entreprise qui vient s'installer, par exemple, en France, qui refuse de payer les impôts, des taxes, et qui préfère, par exemple, faire ce qu'on appelle l'optimisation fiscale. C'est-à-dire, on fait du profit, mais on déclare que voilà, on ne fait pas parce qu'en fait, le siège est dans un autre pays. Comment est-ce qu'on fait pour résoudre ça? Donc, moi, je suis un peu pessimiste à ce niveau-là. Et enfin, pour terminer, alors, comment est-ce que dans un contexte de corruption, on peut, n'est-ce pas, résoudre les inégalités? Vous avez des États, par exemple, où le gouvernement, très souvent, il y a les pots de vin qui circulent, et puis, voilà, la population qui est un peu coupée, enfin, les gens sont un peu coupés de la réalité, et les multinationales s'installent à l'intérieur du pays, font du profit et ne paient pas les taxes. Voilà. Donc, ce sont ces raisons qui m'amènent à être très, très pessimiste. Voilà un peu. Donc, je ne sais pas si vous avez des solutions de votre côté là-bas, parce que moi, je suis très, très pessimiste lorsqu'on entend parler des paradis fiscaux, etc., parce que c'est les trous noirs de la finance qui font en sorte qu'il y a beaucoup d'inégalités. Merci.
Can I respond to that?
Please.
You didn't give me a chance to sort of rebut on some of the things that these guys said at the end. I actually resent the equation of what I'm saying with disrespect for democratic institutions. I'm saying the democratic institutions we have now are not the ones we need now. We need another set of democratic institutions that are more in line with what it is. And everybody seems to agree, and Carlos, you said it, which is that you need to attack the concentration of power. You can't attack the concentration of power until you first decentralize that power away from being concentrated. You can't say that I'm going to leave the power concentrated at the top, and I'm now going to attack the concentration of power, knowing fully well. So the issue is not democratic accountability. And he raised the question in a much better way. It's not democratic accountability. It's democratic distance. You can't have democratic accountability when democratic distance is very high. You wouldn't allow your neighbor or somebody in your neighborhood to incorporate a company in some other country if all the business was happening here, if it was within your jurisdiction and capacity to do anything about it. Today, it's not. You don't even know who's doing it. Yeah. Democratic distance is the real problem.
All right, well, with only a few minutes left, I want to tackle more of his question. Particularly, we didn't talk about corruption. He was the one to bring up corruption here, and I really want to know how this plays into it. Because even then, in your ski match, a lot of corruption is local, is very much local institutions. So Khalid, please, you want to take a stab at it first?
I think Martin kind of hinted at this, but if you look at post-tax income distributions in Europe, you see a great difference between, say, the US and European experiences. Post-tax distribution, income distributions are much more equal in Europe than they are in the States. So it does matter how you tax and spend, fundamentally. There's no way out of it. So if you compare that situation with Pakistan, where taxation is only 10% of GDP, you're looking at a huge issue there when agriculture income is not even taxed. So of course there's going to be that. The question is, how do you get to that? And there are no easy answers to that, I'm sorry, except you have to change society and you have to find ways of doing that. Now, in the old days, people would talk about land reforms. People don't talk about that anymore because somehow it's an inconvenient issue. They want to address that. You have to somehow disrupt the patterns of power, which are equally true, by the way, at the local level. The argument against decentralization has been that countries which tried that, there's a lot of experience on this, have found it very difficult to impose national standards and national ways of doing things. So there are no easy choices. So I wish there was but I think the bigger question is if the ruling elites are not pro-development, it's very difficult to overcome that, short of doing something which is dramatic.
Well, just to aside here, I said this is why Paul Romer, I've written about his effort to do charter cities, to literally create enclaves as an attempt to undermine elites. I mean, talk about dramatic there to do that. Ricardo, do you have a comment on this?
Well, I mean, I have a comment from the corruption
yes,
thing, because, I mean, I think it's another kind of like side of a similar dice, in the sense that, I mean, like, people in power engage in corruption because they think they can get away with it. And why they can't get away with it is just because they can bend the rules in their favor. You know, I mean, so you can have like all the regulations and all the laws against corruption, but if they're not applied, then they don't. I mean, they don't mean anything. And then the question is like, why? I mean, why is it that in some countries, you actually, when you engage in bribery and things like that, you actually pay a price. You go to jail or whatever. You lose your job or whatever. And why in some countries you don't? And I think that relates to, like, I mean, you call it what you want. You know, democratic distance. You know, like, I mean, I think we're talking about the same, basically, more or less. And the question is, like, I mean, so in terms of corruption, yeah, like, I mean, so these people are so detached from the laws and the rules and just being accountable to the system or the citizens that you know, that's what happens. And I think so what you see when you have all this kind of like endemic systematic problems like corruption, what comes down is to weak institutions, you know, and then you have to, I mean, you have to tackle those weaknesses one by one, little by little. It's not going to happen overnight. It's not going to happen through kind of a reformation or a revolution. It's not. I mean, that's. I mean, for me, that's the big learning from the Arab Spring. It's not going to happen overnight. You know, like, I mean, you need to work really hard every day and at every different level to close that distance and then make people connected to the government.
Yeah, I think we have time for another question. If there's another out there.
Respond to the gentleman
Yes,
on the
please.
paradis fiscaux.
Please.
Vous avez soulevé la question des paradis fiscaux et vous avez raison de la soulever. Et j'ai essayé de dire un mot là-dessus auparavant pour dire qu'il y a quand même des choses qui sont faites au niveau international avec l'initiative BEPS de l'OCDE qui est maintenant reprise aussi au niveau de la Commission européenne. Et en fait, la semaine prochaine, ou même à la fin de la semaine à Antalya, le G20 va approuver les initiatives sur l'échange automatique d'informations entre les pays. Donc, ce n'est pas simplement à la demande du pays, si un pays en fait la demande, qu'un autre pays va lui fournir l'information, mais chaque fois qu'il y aura une entreprise qui va s'installer dans un pays, le pays en question se devra, s'il signe l'accord sur l'échange automatique d'informations, d'informer le pays d'où vient l'entreprise pour que, quelque part, cette entreprise paye des impôts, et en particulier là où elle a ses activités principales. Donc, les choses avancent, et c'est au niveau international certainement, et je pense que l'accord qui va être signé au G20 va dans cette direction, et donc l'OCDE a fait beaucoup de choses dans ce domaine. Mais c'est vrai que les choses avancent lentement. Je veux dire, on change le monde petit à petit. On n'est pas au-devant d'une grande révolution. Mais il y a à la fois les paradis fiscaux qui touchent les entreprises, mais il y a aussi le secret bancaire au niveau des individus pour éviter en particulier l'évasion fiscale au niveau des individus et toute la corruption, le blanchiment d'argent, etc. Il y a aussi beaucoup de choses qui sont faites au niveau international dans ce domaine, y compris et beaucoup même par l'OCDE. Donc il y a de l'espoir en quelque
All right, any other questions? No? All right, well, in that, I guess I'm going to end it with the pessimistic sort of end of our discussion here about institutions makes me think of a line by James Robinson, the co-author of Why Nations Fail, told me, that we know why Sierra Leone is corrupt and doesn't work. What we don't know is how to build South Korea. So I guess we'll have to struggle toward it one day at a time. And Ash, you'll have to get to work on building some new institutions for us.
How would you put the U.S. in that category?
Let's not even get started on the U.S. and its institutions. May I have a round of applause for our panelists, please?
Merci beaucoup à Craig Lindsay et à tous les participants qui ont été extrêmement réactifs et dynamiques. It was a very good session. Thank you very much all.
Thank you.
Merci à vous aussi donc d'être encore là, et vous avez raison, car dans quelques minutes nous allons avoir le privilège et l'honneur d'accueillir donc la dernière session de la journée, qui s'annonce aussi intéressante que les précédentes, avec des invités aussi prestigieux que Yann Arthus Bertrand, que vous connaissez, de la fondation Good Planet, Jacques Attali aussi. Nous allons retrouver Gérard Mestralet et d'autres encore pour parler justement, puisqu'on vient d'aborder le thème des inégalités, nous allons parler maintenant de l'accès à l'énergie pour tous. Comment faire? Quelles sont les solutions? Quels sont les diagnostics? Et puisque nous arrivons à ce stade de l'après-midi, je voudrais demander à Jean-Paul Fitoussi peut-être de faire un petit point pour tous ceux qui sont ici. On arrive presque à la fin de la première journée. Quel est votre sentiment, Jean-Paul?
Eh bien, j'ai beaucoup appris, donc je suis satisfait. Et j'ai entendu des débats de grande qualité. J'ai perçu quelques idées nouvelles.
Lesquelles?
Eh bien, relativement à la façon d'organiser l'accountability démocratique. Et cela fait partie de mes préoccupations majeures, car il me semble que la démocratie est le bien le plus précieux qu'il nous reste. Bon, et que nous sommes en train de parler de la démocratie depuis le début de nos sessions, puisque nous parlons des inégalités. Et la forte croissance des inégalités ne peut pas laisser un régime démocratique indemne. Donc, j'ai beaucoup appris. J'ai beaucoup appris sur l'avenir du travail, et cela n'a pas du tout apaisé mes inquiétudes. Ça les a au contraire accrues, et il me semble que tout cela participe à une tendance de long terme qui se dessine et qui ne va pas contredire ce que l'on dit sur les prévisions. Les prévisions sont faites pour être démenties. Donc nous prévoyons que les choses iront mal, mais il n'appartient qu'à nous-mêmes de faire qu'elles aillent mieux.
C'est presque la philosophie. Mais et vous avez vu qu'il y avait un thème ce matin qui a surgi, qui n'était pas prévu au programme, mais qui s'est imposé à nous, qui est celui des migrations. C'est une nouvelle source, d'inégalité, mais aussi de désaccord entre l'Europe et le reste du monde. On a vu quelques échanges assez vifs ce matin et intéressants.
Oui, c'est une source de désaccord entre pays. C'est un élément d'où naît le populisme, mais c'est en même temps une solution. C'est une solution au vieillissement démographique de la plupart des pays développés. Donc nous sommes confrontés à un problème dont les dimensions de long terme ne coïncident pas du tout avec celles de court terme qui exaspèrent les populations lorsqu'elles trouvent des bidonvilles installés près de chez elles. Nous sommes dans des dynamiques qui pourraient permettre de résoudre des problèmes de long terme qui autrement auraient des conséquences catastrophiques.
Merci Jean-Paul Fitoussi. Je rappelle que vous êtes le fondateur et le président du Forum du Nouveau Monde qui est actuellement dans sa 7e édition, la 3e à l'OCDE. Ce que je voudrais vous dire à vous tous qui êtes là, si vous voulez, je vois qu'il y a beaucoup de jeunes en particulier qui sont sur les extrêmes droite et gauche de la salle. Vous pourrez peut-être vous rassembler au cœur de la salle pour faire une assistance plus compacte si vous le souhaitez. Vous pouvez prendre vos affaires. En tout cas, vous verrez aussi bien et même peut-être mieux si vous vous mettez tout près de la scène. Alors, nous allons bientôt entamer la dernière session de la journée. Je vois que Angel Gouria est là. Monsieur le secrétaire général, on fait un petit point juste d'étape comme ça. Comment s'est passé les suites de l'Economic Outlook que vous avez présenté? Alors, je vous en remercie pour la première fois dans le cadre du forum. Quelles sont les réactions à l'extérieur, si j'ose dire?
À l'extérieur, on a eu déjà, à travers la presse, on a eu beaucoup des expressions d'intérêt. Et ce qui est intéressant, c'est comme dans cette édition, on a les chapitres par pays. Et c'est ça qui attire l'attention dans chaque capitale et dans les journaux de chaque pays en particulier. C'est ça qui sort très fort. C'est The Irish Times concerné avec les chiffres qui liés à l'Irlande, etc. Alors, ça c'est déjà c'est lancé, démarré. Je dirais que c'est partout. Mais le concept fondamental sur la question de la croissance ralentie et aussi de la question de commerce particulière, le rôle de la Chine, mais aussi le rôle de l'investissement, faible performance d'investissement, du commerce, du crédit et des pays émergents. Comme pour les quatre pattes, dit-on, de la chaise ou de la table, qui aujourd'hui ne fonctionnent pas parfaitement, de manière très coordonnée, ou même qui sont des pattes qui sont d'une longueur différente.
Tout à fait. Merci. Ça ne va pas être facile pour les dirigeants de tous les pays, quels qu'ils soient, avec cette faible croissance.
L'idée, ce n'est pas de faire une critique, mais de faire un diagnostic, mais aussi d'encourager les leaders, les ministres, mais aussi les entrepreneurs, les syndicats, pour s'engager dans ce défi, parce que, comme on a dit, sans action collective et sans réforme structurelle, on va pas être capable de tourner la page et de transformer cette médiocrité qu'on voit ici dans le moyen long terme dans une opportunité pour une croissance soutenable.
Merci. En tout cas, vous voyez que l'énergie du secrétaire général de l'OCDE est toujours au rendez-vous. Merci.